One pilot. Over 60 enemy aircraft. No fighter escort. December 13th, 1943. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair spots a massive Japanese formation heading for his airbase in Burma. His squadron is still taking off. The enemy will reach their target in minutes. Adair makes a decision that violates every tactical manual. He attacks alone. This is the Pacific Theatre between 1941 and 1945, where small forces faced vastly superior numbers, where split-second decisions determined the fate of campaigns. From Midway's coral runways to the waters off the Philippines, 8 true accounts emerge from the Pacific War. Each story features men who confronted overwhelming enemy strength and somehow found ways to fight back. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose precision bombing helped turn the tide at Midway. Commander Beckton, whose destroyer endured repeated kamikaze attacks off Okinawa. Captain Copeland, whose small escort vessel charged into a Japanese battle fleet. Ordinary servicemen who faced extraordinary circumstances. These accounts come from official war records, survivor testimonies, and documented after-action reports. No Hollywood embellishment needed. The historical record speaks for itself. What drives someone to press forward when every tactical advantage belongs to the enemy? When retreat seems logical but duty demands action? The answers lie in 8 true stories of courage under fire. The war could have ended differently because of months of painstaking intelligence work in Honolulu. Throughout the spring of 1942, a team of Navy cryptanalysts working in the basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters had been breaking the Japanese Naval Code. They called it JN-25. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team had been intercepting Japanese radio traffic since Pearl Harbor. By late May, their persistent efforts had revealed something massive was coming. The Japanese were planning an operation against a target they codenamed AF. But where was AF? Rochefort suspected AF was Midway Atoll. To confirm this theory, he orchestrated a clever deception. He had Midway's garrison send an uncoded radio message reporting their water purification system had broken down. 2 days later, Japanese radio traffic mentioned that AF was having water problems. Midway it was. Admiral Chester Nimitz now knew the Japanese were coming. More crucially, he knew when and with what force. The Japanese planned to use their most powerful weapon, the Kido Butai, a carrier strike force built around 4 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers. The same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best had no knowledge of this intelligence breakthrough as he climbed into his SBD Dauntless dive bomber on the morning of June 4th. The 32-year-old pilot from Bayonne, New Jersey, commanded Bombing Squadron 6 aboard the USS Enterprise. 14 aircraft under his direct command. Best knew the Japanese were somewhere out there in the vast Pacific. What he didn't know was that his actions in the next few hours would help determine whether the United States Navy would survive as an effective fighting force. At 6:16 that morning, 72 Japanese bombers and their fighter escorts had swept over Midway Island like a steel hurricane. Air raid sirens screamed across the coral atoll as anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The Japanese bombers systematically targeted the power plant, oil storage facilities, the seaplane hangar, and the Marine Command Post. American defenders fought back fiercely, downing several Japanese aircraft. More importantly, for Best and his fellow pilots, Midway's runways remained intact. The island could still launch aircraft, and American forces were about to need every plane they could get airborne. At 7:30 a.m., Best received the order every carrier pilot both anticipated and dreaded. Launch aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led the strike force, 32 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise. Best commanded 14 of those aircraft in Bombing Squadron 6. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led another 18 in Bombing Squadron 3. Their mission was simple in concept, nearly impossible in execution: find and destroy the Japanese aircraft carriers. The Kido Butai represented the heart of Japanese naval aviation. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, each capable of launching dozens of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. Together, they carried more aircraft than the entire American force defending Midway. If these carriers survived the day, they would likely finish what Pearl Harbor had started. But first, the Americans had to find them. McCluskey led his formation west-southwest, following intelligence estimates of where the Japanese carriers should be. For nearly an hour, they saw nothing but empty ocean. Blue water stretched to every horizon. Worse, their fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels. Soon, they would face a choice between continuing the search and having enough fuel to return home. Best watched his fuel gauge with growing concern. Every minute spent searching was a minute less in his tanks. But turning back meant abandoning the mission and possibly losing the war. Then McCluskey spotted something that changed everything. A white wake in the ocean below, the trail of a Japanese destroyer moving at high speed. The ship was clearly racing to catch up with something. McCluskey made an intuitive leap that would prove brilliant. The destroyer was heading toward the Japanese carriers. He followed the wake north. At 9:20 a.m., the dark shapes on the horizon resolved into the most fearsome naval force in the Pacific. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers spread across miles of ocean, the Kido Butai. But something was wrong with the Japanese formation. Instead of the tight, mutually supporting diamond formation they typically maintained, the carriers were scattered. Each ship was several miles from the others, having maneuvered independently to avoid American torpedo attacks that had been ongoing for the past hour. Best could see the aftermath of those attacks below. American TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from the USS Yorktown were being systematically destroyed by Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The slow, vulnerable torpedo planes stood no chance against the Japanese defenses. Most of the squadron's aircraft would never return home. But their sacrifice had served a crucial purpose. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol was now at sea level, focused on the torpedo planes. The carriers had used up precious time and fuel maneuvering to avoid torpedoes. Most critically, Japanese aircraft were caught on deck, refueling and rearming, unable to launch. McCluskey's dive bombers held the element of surprise. Unknown to McCluskey and his pilots, another stroke of fortune was about to unfold. A dive bomber squadron from USS Yorktown had arrived over the Japanese fleet at almost exactly the same moment. Neither American squadron knew the other was there. If both groups attacked the same target, confusion would result and opportunities might be missed. McCluskey quickly assessed the targets below. The nearest carrier was the massive Kaga. 2 miles ahead of her steamed the Akagi, flagship of Admiral Nagumo, commander of the Kido Butai. Further out were the Hiryu and Soryu. Over the radio, McCluskey made a split-second decision that would determine which targets each squadron would attack. Earl, you and I take the carrier on the left. Best, you take the carrier on the right. But Best never heard the transmission clearly. What happened next occurred in seconds, but would be analysed by military historians for decades. Both McCluskey and Best prepared to attack the Kaga, the same target. Best formed his 14 aircraft into an echelon formation and prepared for his bombing run. He was unaware that above him, McCluskey and Gallagher were preparing to do exactly the same thing. Best began his dive. At that moment, McCluskey's formation came down in front of him. Best had to abort his dive quickly to avoid the other aircraft. While historians debate exactly how close the formations came, Best clearly had to maneuver at the last moment to avoid confusion. Best reacted quickly. He pulled back on his stick, aborting his dive. Realizing that McCluskey and Gallagher were attacking the Kaga, he made a rapid tactical decision. He could join the attack on the Kaga, or he could attack a different target, spreading the damage across multiple Japanese carriers. He chose the more difficult option. Closing his dive flaps, Best waggled his ailerons, trying to signal his squadron to abort the attack on Kaga. But he was too late for most of his pilots. The majority of his aircraft had already committed to their dives and joined the attack on the Kaga. Only Best's 2 wingmen, Lieutenant Edward Kroger and Ensign Frederick Weber, were close enough to see his signals and abort their attacks. 3 aircraft against the entire Japanese fleet. The odds were beyond desperate. But Best had identified a target that would prove even more valuable than the Kaga. The Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, and the nerve center of the entire Japanese operation. Below them, the Kaga was already under devastating attack. McCluskey, Gallagher, and the other American dive bombers were scoring multiple hits on the massive carrier. The exact attribution of which pilot scored which hit would remain unclear in post-battle analysis. But the cumulative effect was undeniable. Armor-piercing bombs were striking the flight deck in rapid succession. The Kaga, packed with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, erupted in a chain reaction of explosions. Aviation fuel ignited in rivers of fire across her deck. Ammunition cooked off in spectacular detonations. Within minutes, the carrier was a blazing wreck, her effectiveness as a fighting ship destroyed. Simultaneously, the dive bombers from Yorktown were attacking the Soryu. Multiple hits tore through her flight deck, unleashing internal explosions that devastated her hangar spaces. 2 carriers were dying in flames. Best climbed his small formation back to 14,000 feet, positioning for an attack on the Akagi. With only 3 aircraft, he couldn't afford to divide his force for attacks from multiple angles. The dire fuel situation meant he couldn't maneuver for an optimal bow-on approach that would give him the carrier's 850-foot length as a target. Instead, Best would have to attack across the Akagi's narrow 100-foot beam. Even a slight miscalculation would send his bombs harmlessly into the ocean. But memories of Pearl Harbor steeled his resolve. The Japanese had caught the American fleet by surprise 6 months ago. Now it was America's turn. "Let's get them, boys." Best gave the signal, and the 3 dauntless dive bombers opened their flaps and eased into their attack dive. Later, Best would recall the moment with remarkable clarity. It was a calm and placid morning, he remembered. It just felt like regular individual battle practice drill. But this was no drill. This was the moment that would determine whether Japan or America controlled the Central Pacific. As they dove toward the Akagi, Best could see a Zero fighter taxiing on the carrier's deck, preparing for takeoff. He was determined to make it the last Japanese aircraft to leave that deck. At a precise altitude, Best centered his bomb sight on the middle of the Akagi's flight deck and pulled the release lever. His 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb plunged toward the flagship of the Japanese fleet. The bomb struck exactly where Best had aimed, dead center on the Akagi's flight deck. Under normal circumstances, a large carrier like the Akagi could absorb multiple bomb hits and continue fighting. But Best's bomb hit at precisely the right place, at precisely the right moment. The flight deck was crowded, with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for another strike on Midway. Aviation fuel carts stood ready to service the planes. Ammunition was stacked nearby. Best's bomb detonated in the middle of this floating arsenal, igniting a catastrophic chain reaction. Explosions rippled across the Akagi's deck as aviation fuel ignited and ammunition cooked off. The carrier's elevator was blown out of its well. Fires spread throughout the ship with terrifying speed. Within minutes, Admiral Nagumo was forced to transfer his flag to another vessel. The Akagi was finished as an operational aircraft carrier. While Best's bomb delivered the decisive blow to the Akagi, post-battle damage assessment would confirm that his was the only bomb from his 3-plane section to score a direct hit on the carrier. Kroger and Weber's bombs landed close enough to contribute to the chaos, but Best's alone penetrated the flight deck. The precision of that single hit sealed the Akagi's fate. As Best pulled out of his dive and leveled off at low altitude, he couldn't resist looking back at his handiwork. The Akagi was wreathed in smoke and fire, clearly doomed. But there was no time to celebrate. Japanese Zero fighters were still airborne, hunting for American aircraft to destroy. Best resisted the temptation to engage the Zeros in dogfighting. His mission was to bomb carriers, not chase fighters. As he turned for home, leaving the devastated Kido Butai behind, he spotted a disturbing sight on the horizon. A black shape that could only be another Japanese carrier, one that had escaped the morning's attack. Racing back to Enterprise as fast as his fuel would allow, Best landed and sprinted to find Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the American task force. On his way, he encountered McCluskey, who had just landed wounded from the battle. Shrapnel and bullet fragments had struck McCluskey during the attack, but he had stayed conscious long enough to bring his aircraft home. Best made his case urgently to Admiral Spruance. There are 3 carriers aflame and burning, but there's a 4th one up to the north. Permission to rearm and take off right away, sir? Spruance, ever cautious, denied the request. No. Wait for orders. We will get them. Best would have to wait until 2:45 that afternoon before receiving orders for a second mission. By then, the available aircraft had been reduced to just 24 SBDs, a shadow of the morning's strike force. McCluskey, still recovering from his wounds, would remain behind. Earl Gallagher now commanded the Enterprise aircraft, while Best led a reduced section of 4 planes. The target was the Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier. At 5 o'clock that evening, the American strike force spotted the remaining elements of the Kido Butai on the darkening horizon. The Hiryu steamed in company with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, still a formidable force despite the morning's losses. But she was alone among the capital ships, the sole surviving aircraft carrier in a fleet built around carrier aviation. The attack developed with less coordination than the morning's strike. Multiple squadrons converged on the Hiryu simultaneously, creating confusion as pilots maneuvered to avoid colliding with friendly aircraft. Once again, Best found himself adjusting his attack approach to account for other American aircraft in the target area. The confusion gave Japanese Zero fighters additional opportunities to intercept. As Best maneuvered for a clear attack approach, he watched in horror as bullets raked his wingman Frederick Weber's aircraft. Weber's Dauntless shuddered under the impact and began a terminal dive toward the ocean below. Best's close friend and fellow pilot was dead, another victim of the brutal calculus of carrier warfare. Rage and determination flooded through Best as he pointed his aircraft at the Hiryu. For the second time that day, he prepared to attack a Japanese aircraft carrier. This time, the attack was personal. Best's bomb was among several that struck the Hiryu in quick succession. Multiple pilots from both Enterprise and Yorktown scored hits on the carrier, creating a pattern of explosions across her flight deck. The combined damage from all the successful attacks created massive craters that seemed to scoop out sections of the ship. Like her sister ships, the Hiryu was wrecked beyond any possibility of repair. As Best turned for home in the gathering darkness, he surveyed the devastation below. In a single day, the Battle of Midway had been won. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the heart of the Kido Butai, lay burning or sunk in the Pacific. Japan's naval aviation arm, built over decades and considered invincible just 12 hours earlier, had been shattered in one afternoon. But the victory had come at a terrible cost. Weber was dead, along with dozens of other American aircrew. The torpedo bomber squadrons had been virtually annihilated. McCluskey was wounded, his immediate flying future uncertain. Best himself would later be diagnosed with tuberculosis, contracted from breathing caustic fumes in his aircraft, effectively ending his combat career. Yet, their sacrifice had achieved something remarkable. In the space of a few hours, the course of the Pacific War had been fundamentally altered. Japan would never again possess the naval aviation strength to threaten American territory directly. The initiative in the Pacific had passed permanently to the United States. Richard Best's successful bombing runs at Midway, his confirmed hit on the Akagi, and his participation in the attack that sank the Hiryu represent one of the most tactically significant individual contributions by any pilot in the Pacific War. His split-second decision to abort the attack on Kaga and redirect to the Akagi ensured that Japanese command and control was disrupted at the crucial moment. His participation in the evening attack against the Hiryu helped eliminate the last Japanese carrier capable of launching aircraft. The codebreakers had provided the intelligence. The strategists had positioned the forces. The torpedo bombers had drawn down the Japanese defences. But in the end, it was individual pilots like Richard Best, making split-second decisions under impossible pressure, who delivered the decisive blows. Midway proved that in modern warfare, technological advantage and numerical superiority could be overcome by superior intelligence, tactical innovation, and individual courage under fire. The lessons learned in the coral waters off a tiny Pacific atoll would guide American strategy for the rest of the war. More immediately, Midway established the template for the stories that would follow. Across the Pacific theater, American servicemen would repeatedly face overwhelming odds and find ways to prevail through skill, determination, and extraordinary personal courage. The war was far from over, but the precedent had been set. Individual actions could change the course of history. The Burma Theatre in late 1943 was aviation's forgotten battlefield. While headlines focused on island-hopping campaigns across the Pacific, a small group of American fighter pilots fought a daily war of attrition over the jungles and mountains of Southeast Asia. They called themselves the Burma Banshees. Second Lieutenant Philip Raymond Adair belonged to the 23rd Fighter Group, an outfit that had inherited the legacy and shark-tooth nose art of the famous Flying Tigers. But by December 1943, the romantic days of the American Volunteer Group were long past. What remained was grinding, dangerous work, protecting Allied airfields, escorting bombers, and intercepting Japanese raids across the vast expanses of Burma and eastern India. Adair flew a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk he had nicknamed Lulubelle after his girlfriend back home. The aircraft was painted with the distinctive shark mouth that had become synonymous with American fighters in the China-Burma-India theatre. But the P-40 was showing its age by late 1943. Newer, faster fighters were beginning to dominate other theatres, leaving the Burma squadrons with older equipment and fewer replacements. The strategic situation in Burma remained complex and fluid. Japanese forces controlled most of the country, operating from well-established airfields around major population centres. Allied forces, primarily British and Indian troops supported by American air units, held defensive positions along the Indian border and in northern Burma. Air superiority shifted daily depending on weather, aircraft availability, and the tactical situation on the ground. For pilots like Adair, this meant constant vigilance. Japanese raids could appear with little warning, targeting Allied airfields, supply depots, and troop concentrations. The Burma Banshees maintained standing patrols and scramble alerts, ready to launch within minutes of enemy contact reports. It was exhausting, dangerous work that wore down both men and machines. December 13th, 1943, began like most other days for Adair. The morning was clear over Assam, with good visibility extending to the eastern horizon where Japanese-held territory began. Adair had already flown 43 combat missions, an impressive total that placed him among the more experienced pilots in the squadron. Each mission brought its own risks and challenges, but the routine had become familiar. That familiarity was about to be shattered. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, radar operators detected a large formation approaching from the east. The contact appeared to be heading directly for the Allied airbase complex where Adair's squadron was stationed. Intelligence reports suggested the formation was substantial. Estimates ranged from 50 to over 60 aircraft, including bombers and escorts. The scramble order came immediately. All available aircraft, launch immediately. Large enemy formation inbound. Adair sprinted to Lulubelle, conducting his pre-flight check with practiced efficiency. Around him, other pilots were doing the same, but the process of getting multiple aircraft airborne took precious time. Engines had to be started, systems checked, and formations organized. Every minute delay brought the enemy formation closer to their target. As Adair taxied toward the runway, he could see other P-40s still in various stages of preparation. Some pilots were just reaching their aircraft. Others were still conducting engine warm-up procedures. A coordinated squadron takeoff would require several more minutes, time they might not have. Then, Adair spotted the enemy formation himself. What he initially took for a small group quickly resolved into something far more threatening. Multiple flights of twin-engine bombers in tight formation, with Japanese fighters providing escort above and below them. Adair's estimate suggested approximately 60 enemy aircraft approaching the base. Later accounts would vary on the exact number, but all agreed it was a substantial force. The tactical situation was clear and desperate. If the Japanese bombers reached their target unopposed, they would devastate the airfield and its facilities. But mounting an effective defense would require time the Americans simply did not have. Adair faced a choice that no tactical manual had prepared him for. He could wait for his squadron mates to launch and form up, creating a proper defensive formation but allowing the enemy bombers to reach their release point uncontested. Or he could launch immediately and attempt to disrupt the attack with a single aircraft. The mathematics were stark. One P-40 against dozens of Japanese aircraft was not a battle, it was suicide. But Adair made his decision based on the immediate tactical requirement to prevent an unopposed bombing attack on Allied facilities. Adair pushed his throttle to full power and took off alone. His plan, developed in seconds, was straightforward. He would attack the bomber formation head-on at maximum range, using his machine gun tracers to create visual disruption and hopefully throw off the bombing accuracy. Even if he could not shoot down enemy aircraft, he might be able to spoil their attack enough to save critical installations on the ground. As he climbed toward the enemy formation, Adair radioed his intentions to the control tower. According to his later recollection, he transmitted, "Look, they're going to be releasing their bombs pretty quick, and I don't know if I can do much of anything or not. I'm going to do the best I can to mess up their attack." The enemy formation maintained its steady approach toward the airfield. Japanese bomber crews were experienced and disciplined, accustomed to flying precise formations that maximized their defensive firepower while ensuring accurate bomb delivery. The escort fighters flew in layered formations above and below the bombers, positioned to intercept any attacking Allied aircraft. It was a textbook approach that had been refined through years of combat operations. Adair understood that his only advantage was surprise. If he attacked the fighters first, he would lose that advantage immediately and accomplish nothing against the bombers. His target had to be the bomber formation itself, even though it meant flying through the concentrated defensive fire of dozens of aircraft. He positioned himself high and to the left of the enemy formation, then began his attack run. In his own words, from a post-war interview, "I started firing pretty long range out because I knew all I could do was fire enough tracers across the front of them to kind of shake things up a little bit." The P-40's 650 caliber machine guns opened fire, sending streams of tracers toward the lead bombers. The effect was immediate. The tight bomber formation began to waver as pilots instinctively maneuvered to avoid the incoming fire. I could see that as soon as I started shooting, they got a little nervous because the bombers were bouncing up and down, Adair later recalled. The precise formation discipline that was essential for accurate bombing began to break down. Adair's high-speed attack carried him through the entire enemy formation. Almost before I knew what was happening, I was around behind the last flight and picked up the last bomber in there and went after his left engine, he remembered. He could see hits on the bomber and what appeared to be damage, but his speed left no time to assess results before Japanese fighters began responding. The Zero fighters assigned to escort duty reacted quickly to the lone American intruder. Multiple aircraft broke off from their escort positions and moved to intercept. But Adair executed a maneuver that took advantage of his aircraft's diving performance. He pushed his stick forward and entered a high-speed dive combined with evasive maneuvering. The aggressive escape maneuver carried him away from the enemy fighters faster than they could follow. When he pulled out of the dive and looked around, the Zero fighters had returned to their escort positions rather than pursue him. Meanwhile, the Japanese bombers had completed their attack run and released their bombs. Whether due to Adair's disruption, defensive ground fire, or other factors, the bomb pattern fell away from the primary target areas. The airfield's critical facilities appeared to have been spared major damage. At this point, conventional tactics called for Adair to return to base. He had accomplished his primary objective of disrupting the enemy attack. His fuel was finite, his ammunition was partially expended, and he remained outnumbered by overwhelming odds. The prudent tactical decision was to disengage and preserve his aircraft for future missions. But Adair decided to press his attack. Historical accounts differ on whether he made one additional pass or multiple attacks. What is documented is that he re-engaged the enemy formation and succeeded in shooting down at least one Japanese fighter. In his recollection, he spotted a Zero that seemed less alert than the others and maneuvered for an attack position. His guns found their mark, and the enemy fighter went down trailing smoke and fire. The engagement that followed tested both Adair's flying skills and his aircraft's capabilities. Japanese fighters converged on him from multiple directions, forcing him into increasingly desperate evasive maneuvers. During one of these encounters, enemy fire found its target. Japanese machine gun and cannon fire struck Adair's P-40. He later described the sound as like a bunch of gravel hitting the aircraft. Behind the cockpit, something vital was hit and caught fire. Flames shot forward around both sides of his armoured seat, filling the cockpit with fire and smoke. Only his aircraft's high speed prevented the fire from consuming the P-40 entirely. The slipstream blew out the flames before they could spread throughout the aircraft. But the damage was severe, affecting his aircraft's control systems. When Adair attempted to pull out of his escape dive, he discovered that normal flight control was severely compromised. The aircraft wanted to pitch nose down, making level flight extremely difficult to maintain. With control cables apparently damaged and trim systems affected, keeping the nose above the horizon required constant physical effort. Adair made a discovery that would become legendary among pilots. He found that inverted flight actually helped compensate for his aircraft's control problems. By flying upside down, he could maintain altitude and even climb. When the engine began running rough, he would roll back to normal flight until it smoothed out, then return to inverted flight. For more than an hour, Adair nursed his crippled aircraft homeward using this unconventional technique. He alternated between normal and inverted flight as circumstances required, covering more than 100 miles of hostile territory. It was an extraordinary demonstration of both piloting skill and aircraft durability. As he approached his home airfield, Adair faced the challenge of landing a severely damaged aircraft. The exact details of his landing approach remain unclear in historical records, but what is documented is that he successfully brought Lulubelle down safely on the runway. The aircraft was extensively damaged but repairable. Mission number 44 was complete. In his later account, Adair said, "For me, mission number 44 was my most exciting. I don't know if I could stand that much excitement again, but after that, I was convinced that number 44 was my lucky number." It was also the number painted on the side of Lulubelle. The mission report credited Adair with one confirmed enemy fighter destroyed and noted that his attack had disrupted the Japanese bombing attack. For his actions, Lieutenant Philip Adair received the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The citation praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in attacking a vastly superior enemy force. Adair's attack on December 13th, 1943, represented more than individual heroism. It demonstrated how single acts of initiative could influence larger tactical situations. His willingness to engage impossible odds achieved measurable results that justified the enormous risk. The disruption of the bombing attack preserved Allied capabilities and potentially saved lives. The Burma theatre would continue to demand such individual initiatives throughout the war. Isolated units facing superior enemy forces would repeatedly find themselves in situations where conventional tactics offered little hope of success. In such circumstances, the willingness of individual servicemen to attempt the nearly impossible often made the difference between victory and defeat. But what happens when the impossible becomes inevitable? For 3 centuries, British naval supremacy had rested on a simple principle: control the seas with the most powerful warships afloat. By December 1941, that supremacy was embodied in ships like HMS Prince of Wales, 35,000 tons of steel, armour and firepower, representing the pinnacle of naval engineering. The newest battleship in the Royal Navy, she mounted 10 14-inch guns capable of hurling shells weighing 1,500 pounds across 20 miles of ocean. Alongside her steamed HMS Repulse, a battlecruiser that had fought at Jutland in 1916 and received substantial refitting during the interwar period. Though updated with improved anti-aircraft armament and fire control systems, Repulse retained the fundamental design limitations of her era, particularly weak torpedo protection compared to modern battleships. Nevertheless, at 32,000 tons, with 6 15-inch guns, she remained a formidable warship capable of engaging any surface opponent. The Royal Navy had dominated global sea lanes for generations through ships exactly like these. Massive, heavily armoured, bristling with enormous guns, they could outfight any surface opponent and absorb tremendous punishment while continuing to fight. Naval doctrine held that properly designed battleships and battlecruisers were nearly invulnerable to anything except other capital ships. Aircraft were considered a threat to lighter vessels, but incapable of seriously threatening heavily armoured warships operating at sea. This confidence in capital ship invulnerability was about to be catastrophically tested. Admiral Sir Tom Phillips commanded Force Z, the hastily assembled squadron built around Prince of Wales and Repulse. Phillips had built his reputation as a competent staff officer, serving effectively as Deputy Chief of Naval Staff and demonstrating solid administrative abilities. However, his operational experience commanding ships at sea was limited, and his appointment to lead Force Z represented the Navy's faith in his theoretical knowledge rather than proven combat leadership. Captain John Leach commanded HMS Prince of Wales, bringing valuable combat experience to the flagship. He had commanded the battleship during her engagement with the German battleship Bismarck earlier that year, where Prince of Wales had contributed to the damage that eventually led to Bismarck's destruction. Leach understood both the capabilities and limitations of modern capital ships through first-hand experience under fire. Captain William Tennant commanded HMS Repulse and was widely regarded as one of the finest ship handlers in the fleet. His seamanship skills were well documented among Royal Navy officers, and his ability to maneuver large warships with precision had been demonstrated repeatedly throughout his career. If anyone could extract maximum performance from a capital ship under combat conditions, it was Tennant. The strategic situation that brought these ships to Southeast Asian waters was increasingly desperate. Japanese forces had attacked Pearl Harbor 3 days earlier, crippling the American Pacific Fleet. Simultaneously, Japanese armies had begun invasions of the Philippines, Hong Kong, and Malaya. British forces in the region were scattered and outnumbered, facing coordinated attacks across thousands of miles of territory. Force Z had been dispatched to Singapore as a deterrent, a visible demonstration of British naval power that might convince Japanese commanders to reconsider their aggressive plans. The mere presence of modern British capital ships was supposed to complicate Japanese strategic calculations and potentially delay their advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive. It was a mission that relied more on psychological impact than tactical effectiveness. But deterrence had failed. Japanese forces continued their attacks throughout Southeast Asia, and intelligence reports suggested that enemy naval forces were supporting landings along the Malayan coast. Phillips faced a difficult decision: remain in port at Singapore, where his ships were safe but strategically irrelevant, or sortie north to intercept Japanese forces and risk his irreplaceable capital ships in combat. Phillips chose to fight. On the evening of December 8th, Force Z departed Singapore and headed north into the South China Sea. Phillips intended to intercept Japanese transport ships and their escorts near Kuantan, where intelligence reports suggested a major landing was in progress. The plan called for a high-speed approach under cover of darkness, a dawn attack on enemy shipping, and a rapid withdrawal before Japanese aircraft could respond effectively. The plan was tactically sound, but strategically flawed. It assumed that Japanese air power in the region was limited and that Force Z could achieve surprise. Both assumptions proved incorrect. Japanese naval aviation units had been positioned throughout Southeast Asia, specifically to support the invasion operations, and their reconnaissance aircraft had already detected the British squadron. More critically, Force Z lacked adequate air cover. The Royal Air Force had promised fighter protection during the operation, but communication difficulties and the rapidly deteriorating situation in Malaya meant that coordinated air support was uncertain at best. Phillips was taking his ships into waters dominated by enemy aircraft with minimal defensive aviation of his own. The first indication of trouble came on the morning of December 9th. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft appeared on the horizon, carefully maintaining their distance while shadowing the British force. Phillips knew his position had been compromised and that enemy air attacks were now inevitable. But turning back would accomplish nothing, and the intelligence reports about Japanese landings at Kuantan required investigation. Force Z pressed northward through the night. At dawn on December 10th, the squadron approached the reported landing site near Kuantan. But no Japanese ships were visible. Either the intelligence had been incorrect, or the enemy had already completed their operations and withdrawn. Phillips found himself in the worst possible tactical situation, exposed to enemy air attack with no targets to justify the risk. The decision to withdraw came too late. As Force Z turned south towards Singapore, lookouts spotted aircraft approaching from the northeast. The Japanese 22nd Air Flotilla, equipped with modern twin-engine bombers and torpedo planes, had found its target. At 11:15 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft began their attack. The initial assault involved 17 high-level bombers targeting HMS Repulse from 14,000 feet. The bombers approached in tight formation, releasing their ordnance in a coordinated pattern designed to maximize the probability of hits. Captain Tennant immediately ordered emergency maneuvers, throwing his 32,000-ton battlecruiser into a series of radical turns designed to avoid the falling bombs. One bomb struck Repulse amidships, penetrating the armor and causing significant damage to her internal spaces. The explosion killed and wounded dozens of men, but the ship's vital systems remained functional. More importantly, her speed and maneuverability were unaffected, allowing Tennant to continue his defensive tactics. What followed demonstrated exceptional seamanship under impossible conditions. As successive waves of Japanese aircraft attacked over the next hour, Tennant maneuvered Repulse with an agility that seemed impossible for such a massive vessel. He turned toward diving bombers to minimize his ship's target profile, then swung hard to port or starboard to avoid torpedo tracks. Time after time, he anticipated enemy attacks and positioned his ship to avoid them. The Japanese attack developed in multiple phases, rather than a single coordinated strike. Following the initial high-level bombing, torpedo planes began approaching at wave-top height from various directions. These attacks were precisely timed to force defending ships into impossible tactical situations. Turning to avoid torpedoes from one direction exposed them to attacks from another. Historical records credit Tennant with successfully avoiding 19 torpedo attacks through superior seamanship. Each successful evasion required split-second timing and intimate knowledge of his ship's handling characteristics. Repulse's anti-aircraft guns added to the defensive fire, creating a curtain of exploding shells that forced attacking aircraft to maneuver and disrupted their aim. Meanwhile, HMS Prince of Wales faced attacks from torpedo planes approaching from multiple directions. The newer battleship carried more advanced anti-aircraft armament than Repulse, including multiple 8-barrel pom-pom guns and numerous smaller weapons. But she also presented a larger and more valuable target to Japanese pilots. Early in the engagement, a torpedo struck Prince of Wales on her port side near the stern. The explosion was contained by the ship's armor and internal compartmentalization, causing manageable flooding initially. However, a second torpedo struck the port outer propeller shaft, causing severe mechanical damage that immediately affected the battleship's performance. The shaft damage proved catastrophic to Prince of Wales's operational capability. The twisted propeller shaft created severe vibrations that damaged electrical systems throughout the stern portion of the ship. Power failures spread to anti-aircraft gun directors and ammunition hoists, progressively reducing the battleship's defensive capabilities. More critically, her speed dropped significantly, and her steering became unreliable. Prince of Wales began listing to port as water flooded her damaged compartments. Emergency pumps struggled to keep pace with the incoming water, while electrical failures continued to spread. Without full electrical power, many of her anti-aircraft guns could not train properly or receive fire control data. The ship remained dangerous to attacking aircraft, but her effectiveness diminished with each passing minute. Admiral Phillips remained on Prince of Wales Bridge throughout the attack, maintaining communication with both repulse and shore-based commands. As his flagship absorbed damage, he attempted to coordinate what defensive measures remained available. But with communication systems increasingly unreliable and the tactical situation deteriorating rapidly, his options were severely limited. The second major wave of Japanese attacks began at 12:20 p.m. This assault involved 26 torpedo planes approaching Prince of Wales from multiple directions simultaneously. With reduced speed and impaired maneuverability, the damaged battleship could not avoid this coordinated attack. 3 additional torpedoes struck Prince of Wales in rapid succession. Each explosion tore massive holes in her hull, flooding additional compartments and increasing her list to port. The battleship's main armament remained functional, but her secondary armament was increasingly ineffective as electrical failures spread throughout the ship. Captain Leach ordered counter-flooding to correct the list, but this measure could only delay the inevitable. Meanwhile, Captain Tennant's defensive tactics in repulse were finally overwhelmed by sheer numbers. At 12:23 p.m., coordinated torpedo attacks from multiple directions made successful evasion impossible. The first torpedo struck amidships on the port side, exactly where the ship's older armour scheme was most vulnerable. Unlike Prince of Wales, repulse had been designed in an era when torpedo protection was less sophisticated. The single hit caused massive flooding that immediately threatened the ship's stability. Within minutes, 4 additional torpedoes found their mark, overwhelming her damage control capabilities completely. The battlecruiser began listing heavily to port as thousands of tons of seawater flooded her hull. Captain Tennant realized that his ship was doomed and ordered all hands to prepare for abandonment. He ensured that distress signals were transmitted, that life rafts were properly deployed, and that the crew abandoned ship in an orderly fashion. His final order was for all hands to gather on the main deck to facilitate rescue operations. Not one man left his post until officially ordered to do so. Repulse capsized and sank at 12:33 p.m., just 10 minutes after the first torpedo struck her. Captain Tennant was among the survivors, fighting his way to the surface and swimming to a nearby life raft. Of Repulse's crew of 1,296 men, 796 survived to be rescued. Prince of Wales continued to absorb punishment from succeeding waves of Japanese aircraft. Additional torpedo and bomb hits sealed her fate, but the larger battleship took longer to succumb than her consort. Admiral Phillips and Captain Leach remained on the bridge as their ship slowly rolled over onto her port side. According to survivor testimony, Admiral Phillips and Captain Leach were last seen on the bridge wing as their ship prepared to capsize. Neither man attempted to abandon ship or save himself. They went down with their vessel, maintaining naval tradition and the highest standards of duty. Prince of Wales sank at 13:20 hours, taking Admiral Phillips, Captain Leach, and 327 other officers and men with her. The survivors, including many wounded, were rescued by accompanying destroyers that had remained in the area despite continued Japanese air attacks. The destruction of Force Z represented more than the loss of 2 capital ships. It shattered fundamental assumptions about naval warfare that had dominated strategic thinking for decades. For the first time in history, modern battleships operating at sea had been sunk by aircraft alone, without any intervention by enemy surface forces. The psychological impact of the disaster extended far beyond its immediate tactical consequences. Britain had built its empire on naval supremacy, and that supremacy had always rested on the invincibility of heavily armoured warships. If battleships could be sunk by aircraft, then the entire foundation of British naval strategy required fundamental reconsideration. More immediately, the loss of Force Z significantly weakened British naval capabilities in Southeast Asia. Japanese naval forces could now operate more freely throughout the region, supporting amphibious operations and interdicting British supply lines. While the strategic situation in Malaya and Singapore would deteriorate over the following 2 months rather than immediately, the naval disaster certainly accelerated Japan's dominance of Southeast Asian waters. The Japanese success also validated their pre-war investment in naval aviation. While other navies had treated aircraft as auxiliaries to surface fleets, Japan had developed aviation units specifically trained and equipped to attack heavily defended naval targets. The destruction of Prince of Wales and Repulse proved that this strategic choice had been prescient. For the officers and men who served aboard these ships, the disaster represented personal tragedy on a massive scale. Families throughout Britain mourned the loss of sons, husbands, and fathers who had sailed confident in their ship's invincibility. The Royal Navy's reputation for invincibility had been built over centuries of victory. Now it lay on the bottom of the South China Sea. Yet the sacrifice of Force Z also contributed to ultimate Allied victory. The demonstration that aircraft could sink capital ships accelerated changes in naval doctrine throughout the Allied fleets. American and British naval aviation expanded rapidly, while resources previously allocated to battleship construction were redirected toward aircraft carriers and supporting vessels. The sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse marked the end of the battleship era and the beginning of aviation's dominance at sea. Captain Tennant's exceptional seamanship and Admiral Phillips's courage could not overcome the fundamental shift in naval warfare that was occurring throughout the Pacific. Individual skill and traditional naval virtues remained important, but they were no longer sufficient to guarantee victory against new tactical realities. December 10th, 1941, proved that even the mightiest warships could fall when confronted with the changing nature of modern combat. Intelligence had never been more precise or more personal. On April 14th, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted and decoded a Japanese naval message that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the combined fleet, would be making an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The message included exact departure times, flight routes, aircraft types, and escort details. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American forces had the opportunity to target the man personally responsible for December 7th, 1941. Yamamoto was not just another enemy commander. He was the strategic genius who had conceived the surprise attack that brought America into the war. His death would represent both tactical victory and symbolic revenge. The intelligence came from the same cryptographic efforts that had enabled victory at Midway. American codebreakers, working with the JN-25 Japanese naval cipher, had achieved remarkable success in penetrating enemy communications. But intercepting enemy messages was one thing. Acting on that intelligence without revealing the source was entirely another. If the Japanese suspected their codes were compromised, they would change their systems and eliminate this crucial advantage. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox personally authorized the mission, codenamed Operation Vengeance. The decision reached the highest levels of American government, with President Roosevelt himself reportedly commenting that the mission should proceed. Yamamoto's elimination would serve both military and morale purposes at a critical juncture in the Pacific War. The tactical challenge was enormous. Yamamoto would be flying from Rabaul to Baalali Island, a route that would take him over Bougainville, territory controlled by Japanese forces and defended by numerous fighter squadrons. The target would be in the air for less than 2 hours, flying in a small formation with fighter escort. American interceptors would have to travel hundreds of miles over enemy territory, achieve surprise, and accomplish their mission without being overwhelmed by defending forces. The 339th Fighter Squadron, equipped with Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters, possessed the range and capability to attempt such a mission. Based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, these twin-engine, long-range fighters could theoretically reach the interception point and return. Additional squadrons and support elements would contribute aircraft and logistics to maximize the mission's chances of success. But the operation would require precise navigation, perfect timing, and extraordinary luck. Major John Mitchell planned the mission with mathematical precision. His calculations showed that 16 P-38s could make the round trip if they carried extra fuel tanks and flew at optimal cruise settings. The formation would include 4 designated killer aircraft responsible for attacking Yamamoto's flight, while 12 others provided high cover against Japanese interceptors. Everything depended on achieving surprise and completing the attack before enemy fighters could respond effectively. First Lieutenant Rex Barber was selected as one of the 4 killer pilots. The 24-year-old from Culver, Oregon, had previous combat experience and was considered one of the squadron's most reliable pilots. He would fly in company with Captain Thomas Lanphier, Lieutenant Besby Holmes, and Lieutenant Raymond Hine. Their specific target, 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, one of which would be carrying Admiral Yamamoto. The intelligence specified that Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 6 a.m. on April 18th in a Betty bomber accompanied by another Betty carrying members of his staff. 6 Zero fighters would provide escort. The formation would fly at low altitude to avoid detection, following a precise route that would bring them over Bougainville at 9:35 a.m. On the morning of April 18th, 16 P-38s took off from Henderson Field and headed northwest across the Solomon Sea. The flight required 4 hours of precise navigation over trackless ocean, maintaining radio silence while burning fuel at carefully calculated rates. Any miscalculation in course, timing, or fuel consumption would doom the mission. Major Mitchell's navigation proved remarkably accurate. At 9:34 a.m., exactly 1 minute before the predicted time, the American formation spotted 2 Betty bombers flying at low altitude near the coast of Bougainville. 6 Zero fighters provided escort, just as intelligence had indicated. After months of planning and 4 hours of flight, Operation Vengeance had achieved near-perfect navigation and surprise. But immediately, complications arose. Lieutenant Holmes discovered that his auxiliary fuel tanks would not jettison, leaving him unable to engage effectively in combat. Lieutenant Hine remained with Holmes to provide protection while the tanks were manually released. This reduced the killer flight from 4 aircraft to 2, Captain Lanphier and Lieutenant Barber. The 2 Betty bombers immediately separated when they spotted the approaching American fighters. One turned inland toward the jungle, while the other headed out to sea. Lanphier and Barber had to make split-second decisions about which aircraft to pursue. With no way to determine which bomber carried Yamamoto, Each pilot selected a target and committed to the attack. Barber chose the Betty heading out to sea. As he closed on his target, Barber found himself under attack from Zero fighters that had quickly responded to the American presence. Tracers streaked past his cockpit as Japanese pilots attempted to intercept him before he could reach the bomber. But Barber had the advantage of speed and surprise, diving from altitude with his P-38 at maximum performance. Barber opened fire with his 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon. The concentrated firepower of the P-38 was devastating against the lightly built Betty bomber. His shells tore through the aircraft's fuselage and wings, starting fires and destroying critical systems. The bomber shuddered under the impact and began losing altitude. Meanwhile, Captain Lanphier engaged the Betty that had turned inland. His attack also succeeded in damaging the bomber severely, causing it to crash in the jungle. Both American pilots claimed successful attacks on their respective targets, but determining which bomber had carried Yamamoto would require post-mission analysis. Barber's target, trailing smoke and fire, attempted to make an emergency landing on the water near the coast. But the damage was too severe, and the aircraft hit the water hard, breaking apart on impact. Barber circled the crash site briefly before Japanese fighters forced him to disengage and head for home. The flight back to Henderson Field proved nearly as challenging as the interception itself. Japanese fighters pursued the American formation for miles, forcing evasive maneuvers that consumed precious fuel. Several P-38s ran dangerously low on fuel, with some pilots making emergency landings at forward airstrips. But all American aircraft and pilots returned safely from the mission. Post-mission intelligence confirmed that Operation Vengeance had succeeded. Admiral Yamamoto had been aboard one of the Betty bombers and was killed in the attack. Japanese search teams recovered his body from the wreckage, and subsequent autopsy results revealed bullet wounds that indicated he had been mortally wounded by American gunfire during the aerial engagement. The architect of Pearl Harbor was dead. The question of which American pilot had shot down Yamamoto's aircraft would remain controversial for decades. Both Barber and Lanphier claimed credit for the decisive attack, and official wartime records initially split the credit between them. However, post-war analysis by Air Force historians and independent researchers has increasingly credited Rex Barber with the attack on Yamamoto's bomber, though the matter was not definitively settled for many years. What mattered strategically was the result. Japan's most capable naval commander was dead. Yamamoto's death created an immediate crisis in Japanese naval leadership. As architect of Japan's naval aviation strategy and the empire's most experienced fleet commander, he was essentially irreplaceable. His strategic vision had guided Japanese operations from Pearl Harbor through the Guadalcanal campaign. No other Japanese admiral possessed his combination of strategic insight, operational experience, and personal authority. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was equally significant. Yamamoto was revered throughout the Imperial Navy as an almost legendary figure. His death suggested that even the most protected and important Japanese leaders were vulnerable to American attack. Morale effects rippled throughout the Japanese military, particularly among naval aviation units that had served under his direct command. But the mission also carried unexpected personal consequences that would resonate until the war's end. Admiral Motome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff and closest advisor, had been aboard the second Betty bomber. When Lanphier attacked his aircraft, The bomber crashed in the jungle near the coast of Bougainville. Unlike Yamamoto, Ugaki survived the crash, though he was severely injured and required weeks of recovery. Ugaki's survival haunted him for the remainder of the war. He had been Yamamoto's most trusted subordinate and closest friend, sharing the admiral's strategic vision and tactical philosophy. That he had lived while Yamamoto died created a burden of guilt and responsibility that profoundly affected his subsequent service. In his private diary, Ugaki recorded his anguish over the events of April 18th. He wrote extensively about the attack, describing how American fighters had appeared like wolves and how he had watched helplessly as Yamamoto's aircraft was shot down. Although I hoped for the best, I knew only too well what the fate of the airplane would be, he later wrote. Ugaki's account provides one of the few Japanese perspectives on Operation Vengeance. He described seeing tracers flashing by our wings as the pilot frantically maneuvered to evade. When his own aircraft crashed, he recalled being thrown forward as everything turned black and feeling the crushing force of salt water pouring into the fuselage. Only luck and the quick actions of the surviving pilot enabled his rescue. The loss of Yamamoto devastated Ugaki personally and professionally. He had lost not only his commanding officer, but his mentor and friend. More broadly, he recognized that Japan had lost its most capable strategic mind at a critical juncture in the war. From April 1943 onward, Japanese naval strategy would lack the coherent vision that Yamamoto had provided. Ugaki continued serving in increasingly desperate circumstances as the war turned against Japan. He commanded carrier forces during the disastrous Battle of the Philippine Sea and later led land-based aviation units in futile attempts to stop American advances. Each defeat reinforced his conviction that Japan was doomed and that his own survival, while Yamamoto died, represented a cosmic injustice. As American forces closed on the Japanese home islands in 1945, Ugaki embraced the fatalism that had characterized his thinking since Yamamoto's death. The concept of honorable death in service to the emperor became increasingly attractive as an alternative to surviving Japan's inevitable defeat. If he could not serve effectively in life, perhaps he could achieve honor through a meaningful death. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast to the nation. For most Japanese, the emperor's words brought relief that the suffering was finally ending. But for Ugaki, surrender represented the ultimate dishonor, the negation of everything he and Yamamoto had fought to achieve. That same day, Admiral Ugaki made his final decision. Refusing to accept surrender, he dressed in his best uniform and took up the ceremonial sword that Yamamoto had given him years earlier. He would lead one final kamikaze attack against American forces, dying as he believed Yamamoto would have wanted him to die. If the war was ending in defeat, at least his personal war could end with honor. Ugaki's final mission departed from Oita Air Base with 11 volunteer aircrew in 3 aircraft. Their target was American ships off Okinawa, though by this point American forces had largely ceased combat operations in anticipation of the formal surrender. The mission was both pointless and tragic, a gesture of defiance that would accomplish nothing but satisfy Ugaki's need for honorable death. No American forces reported being attacked by Japanese aircraft on August 15th. Whether Ugaki's formation found targets, was shot down en route, or crashed for mechanical reasons remains unknown. What is certain is that Admiral Motome Ugaki never returned from his final flight. The man who had survived Yamamoto's death finally joined his commander in death on the last day of the Pacific War. Operation Vengeance thus claimed 2 victims separated by more than 2 years. Yamamoto died immediately on April 18, 1943, victim of precise intelligence and exceptional flying. Ugaki died slowly over the following 28 months, ultimately destroyed by guilt, duty, and the impossible burden of surviving when his commander had not. The strategic consequences of Yamamoto's death extended far beyond the immediate disruption to Japanese naval command. His successors lacked his strategic vision and his ability to coordinate complex multi-theater operations. Japanese naval strategy became increasingly reactive rather than innovative, responding to American initiatives rather than setting the agenda. The initiative in the Pacific War passed permanently to American forces. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. Operation Vengeance demonstrated that American intelligence capabilities had reached unprecedented levels of sophistication. No Japanese leader could feel secure if the Americans could intercept and decode such detailed operational information. The mission's success forced Japanese commanders to assume that their communications were compromised and their movements were being tracked. For American forces, Yamamoto's death provided both strategic advantage and symbolic satisfaction. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor was dead, killed by American pilots, flying American aircraft guided by American intelligence. Justice had been served, and the Pacific War had gained a clarity of purpose that transcended mere territorial conquest. Rex Barber and Thomas Lanphier returned to heroes' welcomes, though the controversy over credit for Yamamoto's death would follow them for the rest of their lives. Both men received the Navy Cross for their actions, and both continued flying combat missions until war's end. Their success at Bougainville represented the kind of precision targeting that would become increasingly common as American technological advantages multiplied. Sometimes impossible odds are exactly what you need. Henderson Field represented more than an airstrip carved from a Pacific jungle. By November 1942, the modest runway on Guadalcanal had become the strategic fulcrum of the entire Pacific War. From this single strip of coral and metal, American aircraft could threaten Japanese shipping throughout the Solomon Islands. If Henderson Field fell, Japanese forces would control the sea lanes from Australia to Hawaii. But the airfield hung by the thinnest of threads. 3 months of brutal fighting had reduced both American and Japanese forces to exhaustion. Marines defending the perimeter lived on half rations, while Japanese soldiers died of starvation in the jungle. Both sides understood that Henderson Field would determine who controlled the southwestern Pacific. On the night of November 12, 1942, Japanese Admiral Hiroaki Abe approached Guadalcanal with overwhelming force. His task force included the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, each mounting 8 14-inch guns capable of devastating Henderson Field through sustained bombardment. Accompanying them were the light cruiser Nagara and 11 destroyers. Against aircraft and ground installations, this force possessed enormous destructive capability. Standing between Abe and Henderson Field was Rear Admiral Daniel Judson Callahan, with Task Group 67.4, 13 ships that represented everything the Navy could scrape together for Guadalcanal's defense. Callahan's force reflected the desperate nature of American naval operations in late 1942. The heavy cruisers USS San Francisco and USS Portland provided the backbone, each mounting 9 8-inch guns. The light cruisers USS Helena, USS Juno, and USS Atlanta added medium-caliber firepower, though Atlanta was designed primarily for anti-aircraft work rather than surface combat. 8 destroyers completed the formation, smaller vessels carrying 5-inch guns and torpedoes. On paper, Callahan's force appeared respectable. 13 ships against 14 suggested rough numerical parity, but numbers told only part of the story. The Japanese battleships alone outweighed Callahan's entire force, and their armor could absorb punishment that would sink any American vessel. More critically, Callahan's ships had never operated together as a unified force. The vessels had been assembled from different task groups under Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's Task Force 67, with crews unfamiliar with each other's capabilities and procedures. Communication protocols varied between ships, and tactical coordination had been practiced only briefly. They were a collection of individual warships rather than an integrated fighting unit. Callahan himself embodied both the strengths and limitations of American naval leadership in 1942. A career officer with extensive staff experience, he had demonstrated administrative competence and personal courage throughout his service. But his experience commanding large formations in night combat was limited, and the tactical situation he faced on November 13th would have challenged far more experienced admirals. The strategic situation allowed no retreat. If Callahan withdrew his force, Abe's battleships would bombard Henderson Field without interference. American aircraft based there would be destroyed or damaged, along with the fuel and ammunition needed to sustain air operations. Japanese reinforcements could then land with greater security, potentially overwhelming the Marine defenders and securing Guadalcanal for the Empire. Callahan chose to fight regardless of the odds. His tactical plan was necessarily simple, given his force's limitations. The American ships would approach in single file, using radar to locate the enemy formation in the darkness. Once contact was established, they would engage with all available firepower while attempting to maintain formation discipline. Success depended on achieving surprise and inflicting damage before Japanese gunnery could systematically destroy his lighter vessels. The plan had obvious flaws. Single-file formation maximized control but limited firepower, with only the leading ships able to engage effectively. Radar contact could be lost or misinterpreted in the confusion of combat, leading to dangerous mistakes about enemy positions. Most critically, night combat favored the side with superior training and coordination, advantages the Japanese traditionally possessed. But Callahan had no alternatives. His force lacked the speed to avoid combat or the firepower to engage effectively from long range. If Henderson Field was to be saved, it would require close-quarters fighting where American determination might overcome Japanese material advantages. At 1:24 a.m. on November 13th, USS Helena's radar detected enemy ships bearing 310 degrees, distance 27,000 yards. The Japanese formation was approaching from the northwest, exactly as intelligence had predicted. Callahan now had positive contact with Abe's force, and perhaps 20 minutes before the enemy reached bombardment range of Henderson Field. What followed became one of the most chaotic naval engagements in American history. The darkness that concealed Callahan's approach also created massive confusion about enemy positions and friendly locations. Radar contacts appeared and disappeared as ships maneuvered, making it impossible to maintain accurate tactical plots. Radio communications became increasingly garbled as combat stress and equipment damage took their toll. Within minutes, Both formations had dissolved into a melee where individual ships fought for survival against whatever targets they could identify. USS Cushing, leading the American column, spotted Japanese destroyers at close range and attempted to attack with torpedoes. But damage from enemy fire prevented an effective torpedo launch, and Cushing found herself engaging multiple Japanese vessels simultaneously. Among her opponents was the battleship Hiei, a vessel over 20 times Cushing's weight and armed with guns that could destroy the American destroyer with a single salvo. Cushing's captain ordered his ship to engage with her 5-inch guns, while attempting to avoid the concentrated fire from multiple Japanese vessels. The small destroyer scored hits on several enemy ships, but she was absorbing devastating return fire. Shells from various Japanese vessels struck her hull and superstructure, starting fires and destroying her combat systems. The unequal contest could have only one outcome, but Cushing's resistance disrupted Japanese formations and bought precious time for other American ships. Behind Cushing, USS Laffey found herself surrounded by Japanese vessels in the swirling melee. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander William Hank, engaged multiple targets simultaneously while attempting to avoid collision with both friendly and enemy ships. Laffey's guns scored hits on several Japanese destroyers, but she absorbed devastating return fire from superior numbers. Like Cushing, Laffey was eventually overwhelmed and sunk, but not before inflicting significant damage on her attackers and further disrupting Japanese tactical coordination. USS Atlanta discovered the dangers of her anti-aircraft specialization in a surface engagement. Japanese searchlights illuminated her superstructure, making her a target for every enemy gun within range. Shells rained down on the light cruiser from multiple directions, starting fires and destroying her combat systems. Worse, friendly fire from other American ships added to her punishment as identification became nearly impossible in the chaos of close-quarters night combat. USS Portland initially engaged effectively with her 8-inch guns, scoring hits on Japanese vessels. But early in the engagement, a Japanese torpedo struck her stern, jamming her rudder and forcing her into a circle. Unable to maneuver effectively, Portland's contribution to the battle was severely limited, though her guns continued firing when targets appeared within range. Her predicament illustrated how quickly effective ships could be neutralized by single hits in night combat. USS Juno, another light cruiser in Callahan's formation, engaged Japanese destroyers with her 6-inch guns while attempting to avoid the concentrated fire directed at larger American vessels. She absorbed damage during the engagement, but remained operational when the immediate battle ended. However, her ordeal was far from over. She would be sunk later that same day by a Japanese submarine, taking with her the 5 Sullivan brothers who had enlisted together after Pearl Harbor. At the center of this maelstrom, Admiral Callahan attempted to maintain tactical control from USS San Francisco's bridge. Radio messages flooded in from his scattered ships, reporting enemy contacts, damage, and requests for orders. But the tactical situation was changing too rapidly for centralized control, and the confusion of night combat made accurate assessment nearly impossible. By the time Callahan could process information and issue orders, the circumstances had already changed completely. San Francisco herself became locked in a gunnery duel with multiple Japanese vessels, including the battleship Hiei. The American cruiser's 8-inch guns scored multiple hits on the Japanese vessels, starting fires and damaging their superstructures. But the return fire was devastating, with shells of various calibers striking San Francisco's hull and superstructure. Each hit caused massive damage, progressively reducing the ship's fighting capability. At 1:50 a.m., a Japanese salvo struck San Francisco's bridge directly. The explosion was catastrophic. Admiral Callahan died instantly, along with Captain Cassin Young and most of the bridge crew. In seconds, the American task group had lost its commander, and the flagship had lost its leadership. San Francisco's guns continued firing under local control, but the ship had no overall direction and no means of coordinating with other American vessels. In the aftermath of the bridge hit, Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless found himself in an impossible situation. The ship's communications officer had been thrown clear of the explosion by sheer luck, but he now faced the wreckage of San Francisco's command structure. With both the admiral and captain dead, and the executive officer severely wounded, someone had to take control of the ship. McCandless faced a decision that would define his career and possibly determine his ship's survival. By naval regulations, he had no authority to command San Francisco. As communications officer, he was not even in the normal chain of succession. But with the ship's leadership destroyed, and the battle still raging around them, formal authority mattered less than immediate action. McCandless made the decision to assume control of San Francisco, regardless of his technical position. What followed was one of the most remarkable displays of individual initiative under fire in naval history. McCandless immediately assessed San Francisco's condition and remaining capabilities. The ship was heavily damaged, but still afloat and fighting. Her main battery remained operational under local control, and her engines continued to function despite hull damage. Most critically, she was still capable of engaging enemy vessels and contributing to the battle's outcome. But McCandless recognized that his primary responsibility was to keep San Francisco fighting effectively, not to attempt control of the entire scattered task group. The other American vessels were too dispersed, and the situation too chaotic for anyone to re-establish centralized command. Each ship would have to fight independently, making decisions based on immediate tactical circumstances rather than coordinated planning. McCandless focused on ensuring that San Francisco continued contributing to the collective American effort. His leadership of San Francisco during the remainder of the engagement was tactically sound and strategically focused. Rather than attempting detailed maneuvering that might expose the damaged ship to additional punishment, he concentrated on maintaining gun action against identified enemy targets. His communications training enabled him to coordinate effectively with San Francisco's remaining department heads, ensuring that damage control and gunnery continued despite the loss of formal command structure. Under his direction, the cruiser remained an effective fighting unit. Throughout the early morning hours, the scattered American ships continued engaging Japanese vessels in a series of individual combats rather than a coordinated battle. Each captain made independent decisions about targets and tactics, responding to immediate threats rather than following a unified plan. The loss of centralized command had fragmented the American force, but it had also created multiple independent threats that the Japanese had to address simultaneously. Paradoxically, the chaos that destroyed American coordination also disrupted Japanese plans. The battleship Hiei, primary target for American guns throughout the engagement, absorbed numerous hits from various American vessels. While individually these hits might have been manageable, their cumulative effect was severe. Fires spread throughout her superstructure, her communications were disrupted, and her ability to conduct precise bombardment was compromised. Admiral Abe found his flagship damaged and his force scattered, making the careful bombardment of Henderson Field impossible under current circumstances. As dawn approached, both sides began assessing their situations and considering withdrawal. The Americans had lost 4 destroyers and suffered severe damage to their cruisers, but they had accomplished their primary mission. The Japanese retained superior firepower, but their bombardment mission had been disrupted and their flagship was severely damaged. Neither side could claim tactical victory, but the strategic outcome favored the Americans. Admiral Abe made the critical decision to withdraw his force rather than continue the engagement. The damage to Hiei and the loss of tactical coordination made effective bombardment of Henderson Field unlikely. More importantly, Dawn would bring American aircraft from the very airfield he had been sent to destroy. Without air cover, his ships would be vulnerable to attack throughout their withdrawal. By sunrise, both fleets had withdrawn from the immediate battle area. The Americans had lost USS Cushing, USS Laffey, USS Barton, and USS Monson, with severe damage to their cruisers. Japanese losses included 2 destroyers, with the battleship Hiei so severely damaged that she would sink later that day from accumulated damage and air attacks. But most importantly, from the American perspective, Henderson Field remained operational and capable of launching aircraft. McCandless's actions during the crisis earned him the Medal of Honor and promotion to full commander. The citation praised his conspicuous gallantry and exceptional heroism in taking command of San Francisco after the death of her senior officers. But his contribution extended beyond individual heroism to demonstrate how initiative and tactical thinking could maintain fighting effectiveness even when formal command structures collapsed. The battle illustrated several important lessons about naval warfare in the Pacific. Night combat favored neither side exclusively. While the Japanese had superior training and coordination, American radar and determination could offset these advantages. Individual ship actions could be as important as coordinated fleet movements, particularly when circumstances made central control impossible. Most critically, mission focus could overcome tactical disadvantages if commanders were willing to accept heavy losses. The psychological impact on both sides was significant. For the Americans, the battle proved that aggressive action could disrupt Japanese operations even when facing superior forces. Japanese commanders, accustomed to tactical superiority, discovered that American resolve could prevent them from accomplishing their objectives despite material advantages. The initiative in the Guadalcanal campaign began shifting toward American forces, but the cost had been enormous. Admiral Callahan's death deprived the Navy of an experienced commander who had been willing to fight against impossible odds. The loss of 4 destroyers and severe damage to multiple cruisers weakened American naval strength in the Pacific at a critical juncture. Hundreds of sailors died in the dark waters off Guadalcanal, their sacrifice measured in the continued operation of a single airfield. The battle also revealed the importance of technological and procedural factors in modern naval warfare. American radar had provided early warning of the Japanese approach, but it could not penetrate the confusion of close-quarters combat. Radio communications, essential for coordinated action, became unreliable under combat stress and equipment damage. Night fighting remained an art that favored experience and established procedures over technological advantages. In the days following the battle, Henderson Field's aircraft completed the destruction of the battleship Hiei and attacked other Japanese vessels, attempting to support operations around Guadalcanal. The airfield that Callahan's task group had died to protect became the platform for American counterattacks throughout the Solomon Islands. Every aircraft that launched from Henderson Field validated the sacrifice made on November 13th. The naval battle of Guadalcanal became a template for American naval operations throughout the Pacific War. Aggressive action against superior forces, mission focus over tactical preservation, and individual initiative in crisis situations became hallmarks of American naval fighting. The lessons learned in the dark waters off Guadalcanal would guide American commanders from the Central Pacific to the Philippines. McCandless continued serving throughout the war, eventually commanding his own vessel and participating in major Pacific operations. His actions on November 13th demonstrated how individual initiative could maintain unit effectiveness even when formal leadership structures collapsed. When command authority was destroyed, personal courage and tactical understanding provided the leadership necessary for mission accomplishment. The night that saved Henderson Field proved that strategic objectives could be achieved through collective sacrifice and individual heroism, even in the absence of tactical coordination. Admiral Callahan's willingness to fight against overwhelming force, McCandless's decision to assume command of his ship without formal authority, and the crew's determination to complete their mission all contributed to strategic victory. The Pacific War would produce many more examples of individual courage, but few would match the stakes faced off Guadalcanal on November 13, 1942. Sometimes, leadership emerges not from rank or authority, but from the willingness to act when action is required. The waters off Okinawa in April 1945 had become a killing ground unlike anything the Pacific War had yet produced. For 3 weeks, American forces had been grinding their way across the island against fanatical Japanese resistance. But the real battle was being fought at sea, where Japanese kamikaze pilots launched waves of suicide attacks against the invasion fleet. Every day brought fresh horrors as young men deliberately crashed their aircraft into American ships, trading their lives for the chance to sink or damage enemy vessels. Standing guard in this maelstrom was USS Laffey, a Fletcher-class destroyer bearing the name of a ship lost at Guadalcanal 2.5 years earlier. Designated DD-724, she was one of dozens of American warships assigned to radar picket duty, the dangerous mission of providing early warning of incoming air attacks. Positioned miles from the main fleet, these ships served as both sentinels and sacrificial offerings, detecting enemy aircraft while drawing their fury away from the more valuable transports and carriers. Commander Frederick Julian Beckton commanded Laffey with the quiet confidence of a man who had already survived more than his share of Pacific combat. At 34 years old, he was a veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign and numerous other operations throughout the Solomon Islands. His crew of 336 officers and men had trained together for months, developing the seamanship and gunnery skills that had kept them alive through some of the war's most dangerous missions. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for what was coming. The strategic situation around Okinawa had reached a critical juncture. American ground forces were encountering the most determined Japanese resistance of the Pacific War, with every mile costing hundreds of casualties. Japanese commanders had decided that if they could not prevent the American invasion, they could at least make it so costly that the United States would reconsider plans to invade the home islands. The kamikaze attacks represented Japan's most desperate attempt to inflict unacceptable losses on the American fleet. By mid-April, these attacks had reached unprecedented intensity. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft, many flown by pilots with minimal training, were being launched in massive waves against American positions. The radar picket ships bore the brunt of these assaults, facing dozens of kamikaze attacks each day. Ships that had survived years of conventional combat were being sunk or severely damaged by pilots willing to die to accomplish their missions. Laffey's assignment to radar picket station one placed her in the most dangerous position in the entire American fleet. At 4:30 a.m. on April 16th, Laffey's radar operators detected the first enemy contacts of what would become the longest day in the ship's history. Multiple aircraft were approaching from the north, following the same route that had brought kamikaze attacks to other picket ships throughout the week. But these contacts turned away before reaching attack range, leaving Laffey's crew frustrated and on edge. The Japanese were probing American defenses, testing reaction times and defensive patterns. Commander Beckton had experienced these preliminary contacts before. Japanese commanders often sent reconnaissance flights to observe American dispositions before launching major attacks. The probing contacts suggested that a significant assault was being planned, probably timed for later in the morning when visibility would favor attacking aircraft. Beckton ordered his crew to remain at battle stations and prepared for what was coming. The waiting was almost unbearable. Sailors stood at their guns, scanning empty skies for the first sign of enemy aircraft. Radar operators watched their screens intently, reporting every contact and course change. Engine room personnel maintained maximum readiness, knowing that the ship's survival might depend on split-second maneuvering. At 7:30 a.m., the situation suddenly deteriorated. Radio contact was lost, with the F-4U Corsair fighters that provided air cover for the picket ships. These aircraft, nicknamed the Grim Reapers, were Laffey's primary defense against kamikaze attacks. Without air cover, the destroyer would face incoming attacks with only her own anti-aircraft guns for protection. Beckton later wrote that his radar screen at that moment had so many dots on it that it looked at times like an advanced case of chickenpox. More than 50 Japanese aircraft were approaching from multiple directions, converging on Laffey's position like wolves closing on isolated prey. The destroyer was about to face one of the most concentrated kamikaze attacks of the entire Pacific War. The attack began at 8:20 a.m. and would continue for the next 80 minutes. The first aircraft appeared almost simultaneously from multiple directions, eliminating any possibility of coordinated defensive fire. Laffey's 5-inch main guns opened fire at maximum range, filling the sky with exploding shells designed to destroy incoming aircraft before they could reach their target. Beckton ordered emergency speed, pushing his ship to 35 knots, and began the violent maneuvering that would characterize the entire engagement. At flank speed, Laffey was fast enough to complicate the aim of diving aircraft, but not fast enough to escape determined attackers. The chaos was immediate and overwhelming. Aircraft approached from high altitude, wave-top height, and every angle in between. Some pilots displayed considerable skill, maneuvering to avoid defensive fire while maintaining attack courses. Others, clearly inexperienced, flew straight toward the ship through walls of anti-aircraft fire. Laffey's gunners performed magnificently under impossible conditions. The ship's main battery engaged targets at long range, while smaller weapons created interlocking fields of fire at shorter distances. Within the first 10 minutes, multiple Japanese aircraft had been shot down or damaged enough to crash short of their target. But more kept coming, and it was clear that sheer numbers would eventually overwhelm even the most effective defense. The first kamikaze to reach the ship approached from the starboard quarter, diving steeply despite heavy damage from anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft struck Laffey's aft gun mount, exploding on impact and killing several gun crew members. Fires immediately started in the area, threatening ammunition supplies and reducing defensive capability. Damage control parties rushed to contain the fires, while the remaining guns continued engaging incoming aircraft. A second aircraft crashed into the ship's superstructure moments later, causing extensive damage and casualties. The explosion started additional fires and knocked out several communication systems, making coordination between gun positions increasingly difficult. Despite the damage, individual gun crews continued firing at every aircraft within range, determined to protect their ship regardless of the odds. The attacks continued with relentless intensity. Aircraft approached singly and in pairs, some coordinating their attacks to divide defensive fire. Bombs exploded on and near the ship, adding to the destruction caused by kamikaze impacts. Each hit reduced Laffey's defensive capability, while the number of attacking aircraft remained constant. Commander Beckton remained on the bridge throughout the attack, issuing orders and coordinating defensive efforts despite the chaos around him. Explosions rocked the ship repeatedly, and shrapnel filled the air, but he maintained his position and kept his crew focused on their mission. When communications with other parts of the ship were severed, he relied on messenger and visual signals to coordinate defensive efforts. His calm leadership under fire inspired his crew to extraordinary efforts. One of the most devastating attacks occurred when a kamikaze struck near the ship's engineering spaces. The explosion damaged machinery and caused flooding that threatened the ship's stability. Engineering crews worked desperately to maintain power and control flooding, while Japanese aircraft continued attacking overhead. The ship's speed was reduced, making her an easier target for subsequent attacks. Another aircraft crashed into the area near the ship's aftergun positions, causing a massive explosion that disabled several weapons and started fires throughout the stern section. The blast damaged the ship's steering, causing her to turn in a wide circle that made maneuvering nearly impossible. Beckton ordered emergency steering procedures, while damage control parties fought to regain control of the ship's rudder. The loss of maneuverability made each subsequent attack more dangerous. Through the smoke and chaos, signalman second-class Thomas McCarthy noticed that the American flag had been shot down from the ship's mast. The flag represented more than national symbolism to the embattled crew. Its presence told friend and foe alike that Laffey was still in American hands and still fighting. McCarthy understood that restoring the flag would provide a crucial morale boost to his shipmates, while demonstrating American resolve to the Japanese pilots still circling overhead. Without waiting for orders, McCarthy retrieved a replacement flag and began climbing the damaged mast. The structure had been weakened by multiple explosions and was swaying dangerously as the ship turned in her wide circle. Shrapnel and debris littered the rigging, while the constant gunfire made the climb extremely hazardous. Japanese aircraft were still attacking, their bullets and bomb fragments filling the air around the exposed sailor. McCarthy's climb took several minutes, during which he was completely exposed to enemy fire. Other crew members watched in amazement as he worked his way up the damaged mast, struggling with the flag in the wind, while explosions rocked the ship below. When he finally secured the new flag to a makeshift halyard, the sight of the stars and stripes flying over their battered ship electrified the crew. Cheers went up from gun positions throughout the ship, audible even over the sound of battle. The psychological impact of McCarthy's action extended beyond morale. The raised flag demonstrated that Laffey remained an effective fighting unit despite the punishment she had absorbed. Japanese pilots could see that their attacks had failed to break American resistance, and that the destroyer would continue fighting regardless of the odds. What had begun as an attack on a vulnerable target had become a test of wills between determined opponents. But the battle was far from over. More Japanese aircraft were approaching, and Laffy's defensive capabilities had been severely reduced by the previous attacks. Several gun mounts had been destroyed or damaged, ammunition supplies were running low, and fires continued to burn in multiple compartments. The ship's survival would depend on the courage and skill of the remaining crew members. Additional kamikaze attacks struck the ship in rapid succession. Each impact caused further damage and casualties, while reducing defensive firepower. By any reasonable assessment, Laffy should have sunk under the accumulated damage, but the ship's construction and her crew's determination kept her afloat and fighting. Damage control parties worked miracles in containing fires and flooding, while gunners continued engaging every aircraft within range. The Japanese pilots seemed amazed by the destroyer's resilience. What had begun as a routine kamikaze attack had evolved into a prolonged siege of a single American vessel. The battle was becoming a symbol of the broader struggle between American determination and Japanese desperation. Each side was committed to proving their superiority through this single engagement. As the attack entered its final phase, salvation appeared in the form of American fighter aircraft. The F-4U Corsairs of the Grim Reaper's squadron had finally re-established contact with Laffy and were racing to her assistance. Their arrival immediately changed the tactical situation, forcing Japanese aircraft to divide their attention between attacking the ship and defending themselves against American fighters. Within minutes, several kamikaze aircraft had been shot down by the Corsairs, reducing the pressure on Laffy's battered defences. But the Japanese pilots were not finished. Several aircraft broke through the fighter screen and pressed home their attacks on the damaged destroyer. One kamikaze approached so low that it clipped Laffy's mast before crashing into the sea nearby. Another aircraft, damaged by American fighters, attempted a final suicide run but was destroyed by the ship's remaining guns just yards from impact. The air battle above Laffy became increasingly one-sided as more American fighters arrived. Japanese aircraft were shot down in rapid succession, their inexperienced pilots no match for veteran American aviators flying superior aircraft. The kamikaze attacks became more desperate and less coordinated as surviving Japanese pilots pressed individual attacks through increasing fighter opposition. Each attempt was met by concentrated fire from both air and surface forces. The last significant attack occurred as American fighters were driving off the remaining Japanese aircraft. A damaged kamikaze, trailing smoke and fire from fighter attacks, made a desperate attempt to crash into Laffy's superstructure. The ship's remaining gunners poured fire into the aircraft, finally destroying it so close to the ship that burning wreckage fell across her decks. Then, suddenly, the sky was quiet. Laffy had survived 22 separate kamikaze attacks over 80 minutes of continuous combat. She had been struck by 5 kamikaze aircraft and 4 bombs, was flooding in numerous compartments, and had lost most of her defensive armament. 33 of her crew were dead, and 70 more were wounded. But she was still afloat, still flying the American flag, and still capable of fighting. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true extent of Laffy's punishment. Investigators counted multiple direct hits and numerous near misses that had caused additional damage. Her hull was breached in several places, her superstructure was gutted by fire, and most of her weapons were out of action. By any reasonable standard, she should have sunk hours earlier. But Laffy's survival was not simply a matter of luck or superior construction. Her crew had performed with exceptional skill and courage throughout the 80-minute ordeal. Damage control parties had contained fires and flooding under impossible conditions. Gunners had continued fighting even after their positions had been damaged or destroyed. Commander Beckton's leadership had been crucial to the ship's survival. Despite the chaos and destruction around him, he had maintained tactical control and kept his crew focused on their mission. His decision to continue fighting rather than abandon ship had inspired his men to extraordinary efforts. When asked later about the possibility of abandoning ship, Beckton replied simply, "Hell no. We still have guns that can shoot." The battle became legendary throughout the Pacific Fleet as an example of what American determination could accomplish against impossible odds. Laffey's survival demonstrated that even the most devastating attacks could be overcome through skill, courage, and refusal to surrender. The ship became known as the ship that wouldn't die, a title that captured both her physical resilience and her crew's spiritual strength. Thomas McCarthy received the Silver Star for his heroic flag-raising under fire. His action became a memorable example of individual courage in the Pacific War, symbolizing American defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. The image of the flag flying over the battered destroyer inspired sailors throughout the fleet and demonstrated the power of symbolic acts during desperate circumstances. The broader significance of Laffey's battle extended beyond individual heroism. Her survival against overwhelming odds demonstrated the effectiveness of American naval construction and damage control procedures. More importantly, it showed that American crews could absorb punishment that would have destroyed ships and men with less training and determination. The battle became a template for survival under impossible conditions. Today, USS Laffey serves as a museum ship at Patriots Point Naval Museum in South Carolina. Visitors can walk her decks and see the damage that has been preserved as testimony to her crew's courage. She stands as a monument to all the sailors who fought the kamikaze war off Okinawa, and a reminder that the price of victory is measured in human sacrifice. The ship that wouldn't die had proven that sometimes, when everything seems lost, courage and determination can overcome impossible odds. Dawn was breaking over the Philippine Sea when radar contacts and lookouts aboard USS Samuel B. Roberts reported ships on the horizon. At first, the distant silhouettes were unidentified contacts requiring investigation. But as radar plots developed and the shapes grew larger, Lieutenant Commander Robert Witcher Copeland realized he was looking at the most powerful naval force Japan had sent to sea since Midway. Admiral Kurita's center force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, was bearing down on his small escort carrier group with devastating intent. USS Samuel B. Roberts, designated D-413, was not built for this kind of fight. She was a destroyer escort, smaller, slower, and more lightly armed than a fleet destroyer. Her primary mission was hunting submarines and escorting convoys, not engaging capital ships in surface combat. At 1,400 tons displacement, she was dwarfed by the Japanese heavy cruisers advancing toward her, each of which outweighed her by more than 10 to 1. But Copeland and his crew of 210 officers and men faced an impossible choice. Behind them steamed 6 escort carriers of Task Unit 77.4.3, Taffy 3, loaded with aircraft supporting the American invasion of Leyte. These carriers were virtually defenseless against surface attack, their thin hulls and flight decks offering no protection against naval gunfire. If Kurita's battleships reached the carriers, they would be destroyed in minutes, potentially dooming the entire Leyte operation. The strategic situation was the result of massive intelligence, failure, and tactical confusion. Admiral Kurita's force was supposed to have been destroyed by American air attacks the previous day. Instead, he had pushed through San Bernardino Strait during the night and achieved complete surprise against the American escort forces. The nearest American fleet units were hundreds of miles away, leaving Taffy 3 to face the most powerful Japanese surface force of the war. The Japanese force included HIJMS Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed. At 72,000 tons, she mounted 9 18-inch guns capable of hurling shells weighing over 1,500 pounds across 25 miles of ocean. Her armor was designed to withstand hits from 16-inch guns, making her virtually invulnerable to anything Roberts could bring to bear. Yamato alone possessed more firepower than the entire American escort force combined. At 6:45 a.m., the Japanese force opened fire. Colored splashes began erupting around the American ships as Japanese rangefinders zeroed in on their targets. The enemy was using die-loaded shells to help spot their fall, yellow splashes from one ship, red from another, creating a deadly rainbow in the waters around Taffy 3. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding the escort carrier group, immediately ordered his ships to retreat at maximum speed while launching every available aircraft. But retreat alone would not save the carriers. The Japanese ships were faster and would eventually overtake the fleeing Americans. Only aggressive action by the escorts could buy time for the carriers to escape or for help to arrive. It was a mission that required ships and men to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Copeland understood the mathematics of the situation perfectly. His ship and the other escorts of Taffy 3 were about to engage a force that could destroy them without serious risk to itself. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts was going to attack the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a fleet built around the largest battleship ever constructed. At 0730 hours, Copeland addressed his crew over the ship's public address system. His words would become legendary throughout the Pacific Fleet. "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected," he announced. "We will do what damage we can." The crew received this news with remarkable calm, understanding that their captain was asking them to die for their shipmates on the carriers behind them. Copeland's speech reflected the desperate nature of their situation. Roberts carried only 3 torpedoes, her primary anti-ship weapons. Her main battery consisted of 2 5-inch guns capable of damaging destroyers and light cruisers, but virtually useless against battleship armor. She had speed, maneuverability, and the courage of her crew, but little else to offer in surface combat against capital ships. The attack formation was as improvised as it was desperate. 3 destroyers, USS Hole, USS Heermann, and USS Johnston would lead the charge, followed by Roberts and the other destroyer escorts. Each ship would attack independently, using smoke screens and aggressive maneuvering to confuse Japanese gunners while closing to torpedo range. Success would be measured not in ships sunk, but in time bought for the carriers to escape. At 0753 hours, Roberts began her attack run. Copeland ordered flank speed, pushing his ship toward the enemy at 28 knots. It was the fastest Roberts had ever travelled, her engines straining beyond their designed limits. Below decks, Lieutenant Lloyd Gurnett supervised the engineering crew as they bypassed safety systems and fed maximum steam to the turbines. The ship vibrated with the effort, but she held together and accelerated toward the Japanese battle line. The run to torpedo range took 25 minutes of sustained high-speed maneuvering through increasingly accurate enemy fire. Japanese shells began falling close to Roberts, sending up towering geysers of water that drenched her decks. Copeland ordered radical course changes every few minutes, throwing his ship from side to side to spoil enemy fire control. The crew hung on as the ship heeled over in turns that seemed impossible for such a small vessel. At 4,000 yards range, Roberts launched her 3 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Chokai. The fish ran straight and true, with at least one striking the Japanese ship and contributing to damage that would eventually force her withdrawal from the battle. But Roberts' torpedo attack had revealed her position and made her a priority target for every Japanese gun within range. Having expended her primary weapons, she now faced the full attention of the enemy battle line. Having expended her torpedoes, Roberts found herself in the position of engaging with her 5-inch guns. Given the tactical situation, withdrawal was not a realistic option. Japanese forces surrounded the area, and her mission remained to protect the carriers. Copeland made the decision to continue the attack using his ship's main battery, knowing that every minute of continued pressure would help his larger consorts escape. The 5-inch guns could not penetrate heavy cruiser armor, but they could damage superstructures and cause fires that would disrupt enemy operations. For approximately 35 minutes, Roberts engaged in a running gun battle with multiple Japanese heavy cruisers. The small destroyer Escort maneuvered frantically while her gunners poured 5-inch shells into enemy superstructures. Gunner's mate 3rd class Paul Henry Carr commanded the after-gun mount, directing his crew with exceptional skill and determination. Under his leadership, the mount fired at maximum rate, sending shell after shell toward the towering Japanese cruisers. The contrast was surreal, a 1,400-ton escort vessel slugging it out with ships 10 times her size. Roberts's gunners displayed remarkable accuracy and determination throughout the engagement. They fired everything available: armor-piercing shells, high-explosive rounds, anti-aircraft ammunition, even star shells designed for nighttime illumination. The variety of ammunition types created spectacular effects on enemy superstructures, starting fires and disrupting Japanese operations. Several Japanese cruisers were forced to shift their attention from the carriers to deal with the persistent attacks from the small escort. But the unequal contest could have only one outcome. Japanese return fire was devastating, with 8-inch and 14-inch shells straddling Roberts and sending up massive waterspouts. Each near miss shook the small ship violently, while direct hits would have destroyed her instantly. Copeland's seamanship kept her afloat through incredible maneuvering, but the overwhelming firepower arrayed against her made survival impossible. The situation became increasingly desperate as Japanese gunners found their range. Multiple hits struck Roberts in rapid succession, each causing significant damage to her hull and superstructure. The sequence of hits came so quickly that crew members could not distinguish between individual impacts. Explosions rocked the ship continuously as shells penetrated her thin armor and detonated inside vital spaces. One particularly devastating hit struck Roberts amidships, tearing a massive hole in her hull and damaging her engine room. The explosion killed most of the engineering crew and caused catastrophic flooding that threatened the ship's stability. Steam and smoke poured from the wound as the ship began losing power and slowing dramatically. Without engines or full maneuverability, Roberts became an easier target for the advancing Japanese fleet. Another heavy-caliber shell struck near the ship's after-gun mount, causing a catastrophic explosion that would prove fatal to the vessel. The blast tore through the gun position, killing most of the crew and setting off a chain reaction in the ammunition handling room. Paul Carr was thrown against the bulkhead by the explosion, suffering mortal wounds from shell fragments and the force of the blast. But when other crew members reached the wrecked gun mount, they found Carr still conscious and attempting to perform his duties despite his injuries. Carr's final moments embodied the spirit that had driven Roberts' entire crew throughout the engagement. Despite wounds that would prove fatal, he remained focused on his duty and his shipmates. According to witnesses, he was trying to load one final shell into the damaged gun breech when they found him. But the weapon was destroyed beyond repair, and Carr died from his wounds shortly after. The loss of the aftergun mount effectively ended Roberts' ability to fight back effectively. Her forward gun continued firing sporadically, but the ship was clearly doomed. Water poured through multiple hull breaches, while fires spread throughout her superstructure. Damage control parties worked desperately to contain the flooding and fires, but the cumulative damage was beyond their ability to manage. At 10:05 a.m., Copeland gave the order that every captain dreaded: abandon ship. The crew had fought magnificently, but their ship could no longer be saved. The decision was made to preserve as many lives as possible, rather than continue a hopeless fight. Roberts had accomplished her mission. The carriers were escaping, and help was finally arriving in the form of additional American aircraft. The crew abandoned their posts in good order, following procedures they had drilled countless times but never expected to use in combat. Life rafts were launched, and life jackets distributed, while Japanese shells continued falling in the area. The evacuation was conducted with the same discipline that had characterized the ship's entire engagement. Officers ensured that wounded shipmates were cared for, and that survival equipment was properly distributed. Roberts remained afloat for another hour, a testament to her construction and her crew's damage control efforts. She finally sank at 11:05 a.m., taking 90 of her crew with her. The remaining 120 officers and men floated in the tropical waters for approximately 50 hours before being rescued by American ships. Many more died from wounds and exposure during the long wait for salvation. But Roberts' sacrifice had not been in vain. Her attack, along with those of the other Taffy 3 escorts, had disrupted Admiral Kurita's formation and confused his tactical picture. The aggressive American attacks convinced him that he was facing a much larger force than the small escort carriers actually present. Fearing a trap and concerned about the increasing American air attacks, Kurita ordered his fleet to withdraw just as victory was within his grasp. The battle off Samar became one of the most celebrated examples of small ship heroism in naval history. Destroyer escorts and destroyers had attacked the most powerful battleship fleet ever assembled, buying time for their larger consorts to escape. The sacrifice of ships like Roberts saved the escort carriers and preserved American air support for the later invasion. Strategic victory had been achieved through tactical sacrifice. The psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond its immediate tactical results. American sailors throughout the Pacific drew inspiration from the story of the small escorts that had charged a battleship fleet and achieved their objective. Japanese commanders began questioning their assumptions about American resolve and tactical capability. The willingness of American crews to accept certain death to protect their mission objectives demonstrated a level of commitment that impressed even their enemies. Paul Carr received a posthumous Silver Star for his final actions in the wrecked gun mount. The citation praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in attempting to continue fighting despite mortal wounds. His dedication to duty in his final moments inspired his shipmates and became legendary throughout the Navy. A guided missile frigate was later named USS Carr in his honor, ensuring that his sacrifice would be remembered by future generations of sailors. Lieutenant Commander Copeland survived the battle and was awarded the Navy Cross for his leadership during the engagement. His decision to continue attacking after expending torpedoes had kept Japanese attention focused on the escorts rather than the carriers. The continued pressure on Japanese forces had contributed to their ultimate withdrawal and the salvation of Taffy 3. He returned to civilian life after the war, practicing law in his home state of Washington until his death in 1973. The battle demonstrated several important lessons about naval warfare and human nature under extreme stress. Material disadvantage could be overcome through aggressive tactics and superior morale when the strategic situation demanded sacrifice. Individual acts of heroism, when properly coordinated with larger objectives, could influence strategic outcomes far beyond their immediate tactical impact. Most importantly, the willingness to accept impossible odds could sometimes achieve results that seemed impossible. Robert's story also illustrated the evolution of naval warfare during World War II. Traditional concepts of ship versus ship combat had been complicated by aviation radar and new tactical doctrines. Small ships could now threaten large ones through superior tactics, better training, and sheer determination. The age of the battleship was ending, though few realized it at the time of the engagement. The strategic consequences of the Battle off Samar extended throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. Japanese naval forces would never again attempt such an ambitious surface attack against American positions. The demonstration that small American ships would fight to the death against any odds convinced Japanese commanders that future operations would face fanatical resistance. The initiative in the Pacific War had passed irreversibly to American forces. Today, the story of USS Samuel B. Roberts serves as a reminder that heroism is not measured by the size of one's ship or the odds of victory. It is measured by the willingness to do one's duty, regardless of circumstances, and the consequences for oneself. Roberts and her crew faced impossible odds and chose to fight anyway, proving that courage and determination could overcome any material disadvantage when the mission demanded sacrifice. Their sacrifice saved lives, preserved strategic assets, and helped win a war. Sometimes David does face Goliath's entire family, and sometimes David wins through sacrifice and determination. By early 1944, the Pacific War had produced a generation of American fighter pilots whose skill and success were measured in confirmed victories. Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 kills had stood unchallenged for over 25 years. Now, as American forces pushed across the Pacific, several pilots were approaching that historic mark. Among them was Colonel Neil Kirby of the 5th Air Force, flying his beloved P-47 Thunderbolt from bases in New Guinea. Kirby represented the best qualities of American fighter pilots in the Pacific theater. At 32 years old, he was older than most of his peers, bringing maturity and tactical wisdom to aerial combat. He had developed innovative tactics for the P-47 that maximized its strengths while minimizing its weaknesses against more maneuverable Japanese aircraft. His boom and zoom techniques, diving attacks followed by climbing escapes, had become standard doctrine throughout the Pacific and saved countless American lives. The Thunderbolt was not universally popular among Pacific pilots. Many preferred the sleek P-38 Lightning or the newer P-51 Mustang for their speed and maneuverability in dogfighting. But Kirby had demonstrated that the massive, heavily armed fighter could be devastatingly effective when employed correctly. He understood that the P-47's advantages, ruggedness, firepower, and diving performance, could overcome its limitations if pilots followed proper tactical doctrine. By March 1944, Kirby had scored 21 confirmed victories. He was among several American pilots approaching Rickenbacker's record, creating natural competition and public interest in who would break the barrier first. His success had also demonstrated the Thunderbolt's effectiveness in Pacific operations, though the aircraft continued to face questions about its role in the theater. Personal achievement and professional validation had become intertwined in ways that would prove significant. His aircraft, nicknamed Fiery Ginger 4 after his wife Virginia, had become well known throughout the Southwest Pacific. The distinctive shark mouth painted on her nose marked her as Kirby's personal mount, and ground crews maintained the fighter to perfectionist standards. She represented the pinnacle of Thunderbolt performance, equipped with the latest modifications and improvements. But even perfect maintenance could not compensate for tactical errors in combat. On the morning of March 5th, Kirby planned a fighter sweep along the New Guinea coast. Intelligence reports indicated Japanese aircraft operating from airfields in the area, presenting opportunities for aerial combat. Kirby assembled a small formation consisting of himself and two experienced wingmen, Captain William Dunham and Lieutenant Sam Blair. The three pilots had flown together extensively and understood each other's tactics and capabilities. Their mission was to seek out and engage any Japanese aircraft they encountered while providing fighter cover for Allied operations in the region. The flight departed from their forward base at Nadzab and headed northwest along the New Guinea coast. Climbing to 22,000 feet, they maintained radio silence while scanning the skies for enemy aircraft. The morning conditions were excellent for aerial combat, with clear skies and unlimited visibility. Below them, the jungle-covered mountains and coastal plains of New Guinea stretched endlessly toward the horizon. At approximately 9:30 a.m., they spotted their first potential target. A Japanese fighter was visible in the distance, apparently approaching an enemy airfield. The aircraft appeared to be a single-engine fighter, possibly returning from patrol or a mission. After observing the situation, Kirby decided not to engage immediately, likely recognizing that the enemy aircraft was too close to its base for an effective interception. The decision reflected sound tactical judgment. Attacking aircraft near their home airfields often brought swift retaliation from additional enemy fighters. Better to wait for more favorable circumstances that might yield greater opportunities without alerting Japanese forces to the American presence. It was the kind of patient, experienced decision-making that had made Kirby successful throughout his combat career. Within minutes, their patience was rewarded. 3 twin-engine Kawasaki Ki-48 Lily bombers appeared at low altitude, flying along the coast in loose formation. These aircraft represented valuable targets whose destruction would prevent whatever mission they were attempting to accomplish. Kirby signaled his wingmen and began positioning for an attack on the enemy formation. The attack developed according to established Thunderbolt doctrine. Diving from altitude, the 3 American fighters built up enormous speed while approaching their targets. Each pilot selected a different bomber to ensure that the entire enemy formation would be engaged. The Japanese crews, flying at low altitude and focused on their mission, had minimal warning of the approaching attack. Captain Dunham and Lieutenant Blair executed successful attacks on their assigned targets. Their concentrated firepower proved devastating against the lightly built bombers, and both enemy aircraft were destroyed. The bombers crashed into the jungle below, their crews killed by the overwhelming American gunfire. 2 confirmed victories had been achieved with minimal risk to the attacking fighters. But Kirby's attack on the 3rd bomber did not achieve immediate success. His initial burst of gunfire damaged the Ki-48 severely, but did not destroy it outright. The bomber continued flying, trailing smoke, and clearly in distress but still airborne. Standard Thunderbolt doctrine called for climbing back to altitude and making another diving attack to finish off damaged targets. This approach maintained the fighter's energy and altitude advantages while minimizing exposure to enemy defensive fire. Instead, Kirby made a decision that violated his own tactical principles. Rather than climbing away, he turned to pursue the damaged bomber at low altitude. Whether motivated by the desire to confirm the kill, or simply caught up in the excitement of combat, he placed himself in a vulnerable position. The phrase "low and slow" would later be used to describe the dangerous situation he had created for himself. At low altitude and reduced airspeed, the P-47 lost its primary advantages over Japanese fighters. The big American fighter could not outrun or outclimb more maneuverable opponents when caught in such circumstances. Kirby had placed himself exactly where Japanese pilots hoped to find American aircraft, within range of their guns, and unable to escape through superior performance. It was a tactical error that experienced pilots understood could prove fatal. As Kirby pursued the damaged bomber through a series of turns, a Japanese Ki-43 Oscar fighter approached the engagement area. The enemy pilot had likely been patrolling nearby and had either observed the attack or responded to radio calls from the bomber crews. Recognizing an opportunity to attack a vulnerable American aircraft, he maneuvered into position while Kirby was focused on finishing off his target. The Japanese fighter approached from an angle that kept him out of Kirby's field of view until it was too late to take evasive action. Captain Dunham, flying above the engagement, spotted the approaching Oscar and immediately began diving to assist his squadron commander. But he was too far away to intercept the Japanese fighter before it reached attack position. Dunham could only watch as the enemy pilot lined up on Kirby's Thunderbolt and opened fire. The Oscar's guns found their mark, striking the P-47 with bullets and cannon shells. Kirby's fighter shuddered under the impact of enemy fire. Smoke immediately began pouring from the engine, and the aircraft started losing altitude in a shallow dive toward the jungle below. Whether Kirby was wounded in the attack or the aircraft's controls were damaged, the Thunderbolt continued descending without apparent recovery attempts. From Dunham's position above, there was no immediate sign of parachute deployment or emergency procedures. Dunham arrived in time to attack the Oscar that had shot down his commander. His guns destroyed the Japanese fighter quickly, sending it crashing into the same jungle area where Kirby's aircraft had disappeared. Vengeance had been swift, but it could not restore the life of one of America's most successful fighter pilots. The pursuit of individual achievement had extracted its price from the Pacific War's pilot community. Dunham and Blair circled the crash area for several minutes, searching for any sign that Kirby had survived. The thick jungle canopy made observation difficult, and no parachute or survival signals were visible from their altitude. With fuel running low and the possibility of additional Japanese fighters responding to the combat, they were forced to return to base with devastating news. Colonel Neil Kirby was missing in action and presumed killed. The loss devastated not only Kirby's squadron but fighter units throughout the 5th Air Force. He had been more than just a successful pilot. He was a tactical innovator whose techniques had influenced combat doctrine throughout the Pacific theater. His methods had saved American lives and destroyed numerous Japanese aircraft while proving the Thunderbolt's effectiveness in Pacific operations. More personally, he had been a mentor and friend to many younger pilots who looked up to his example and experience. The circumstances of Kirby's loss provided a sobering lesson about combat flying. Even the most experienced and successful pilots could be killed by single tactical errors or momentary lapses in judgment. The pursuit of individual records, while natural and often beneficial to morale, carried risks that extended beyond personal consequences. Every experienced pilot lost was a blow to unit effectiveness and the training of newer aircrew. Captain Dunham continued flying combat missions throughout the remainder of the war. He would eventually achieve ace status himself while serving in various capacities in the Pacific theater. But his most remembered action occurred months later over the Philippines, in circumstances that demonstrated a very different kind of courage. While engaging Japanese aircraft over the Philippine Sea, Dunham shot down a Ki-43 Oscar in aerial combat. The enemy pilot managed to bail out successfully and was descending by parachute toward the ocean below. Throughout the Pacific War, the treatment of aircrew who had bailed out varied considerably between individual pilots and units. Some Japanese pilots had been known to strafe American aircrew in parachutes, and some American pilots had begun responding similarly. The practice, while understandable given the brutality of the conflict, represented a moral degradation that troubled many airmen. Dunham positioned his P-47 for what could have been a strafing attack on the descending enemy pilot. His guns were loaded and ready, and the Japanese airman was completely helpless to defend himself. Many pilots in similar circumstances would have considered such an attack justified revenge for American aircrew who had been killed under similar circumstances. But Dunham chose a different path. Instead of attacking the helpless enemy pilot, Dunham made an extraordinary decision. He flew his fighter down to wave-top height, opened his canopy, and threw his personal life vest to the Japanese pilot struggling in the water. It was an act of compassion that transcended the immediate context of warfare, one human being helping another in distress, regardless of nationality. The gesture risked Dunham's own safety, but potentially saved an enemy's life. Later, Dunham would tell his family that he felt divine guidance in making this decision, as if a higher power had directed him toward mercy rather than vengeance. Whether motivated by religious conviction, basic humanity, or simply personal character, his choice represented the best qualities that could emerge even in the worst circumstances. It demonstrated that individual moral choices could transcend the brutality of warfare. The incident became known throughout his unit and later inspired artistic commemoration. A painting titled "Uncommon Chivalry" now hangs in the Seattle Museum of Flight. It depicts Dunham's Thunderbolt at low altitude, the pilot throwing his life vest to the Japanese airman floating in the ocean below. The artwork captures a moment when humanity overcame the dehumanizing effects of war, when compassion triumphed over the desire for revenge. It stands as testimony to the moral choices that define character even under extreme circumstances. The contrast between these two incidents, Kirby's death in pursuit of personal achievement and Dunham's choice of mercy over vengeance, illustrates the complex moral landscape of aerial combat. Both situations involved split-second decisions made under extreme stress, but they led to very different outcomes. One demonstrated how personal goals could override tactical wisdom with fatal results, while the other showed how individual character could transcend the brutal context of warfare. Kerbai's remains were recovered from the New Guinea jungle in 1948 by an Australian search team. Local villagers confirmed that he had successfully bailed out of his damaged aircraft, but had been wounded either during the aerial engagement or during his parachute descent. He died of his wounds shortly after reaching the ground, ending the life of one of America's most innovative fighter pilots. His body was returned home for burial, with full military honors befitting his service and sacrifice. The National Museum of the United States Air Force now displays a recreation of Kerbai's aircraft, featuring parts recovered from the original wreckage. The exhibit honors both his tactical innovations and his ultimate sacrifice, while serving as a reminder of the costs of aerial warfare. His 21 confirmed victories made him one of America's leading aces, though the record he died pursuing was ultimately achieved by other pilots. His legacy lay not in numbers but in the tactical advances he pioneered and the lives his innovations saved. These stories from the Pacific War reveal the complex nature of heroism under extreme circumstances. Men faced life and death decisions in split seconds, often with incomplete information and under enormous stress. Sometimes the pursuit of achievement led to tragedy, while other times the choice of compassion created moments of transcendent humanity. Both outcomes reflected the fundamental reality that individual character, revealed under pressure, ultimately determined how men responded to impossible circumstances. The price of heroism extends beyond lives lost to encompass the moral choices that define who we become under fire. What drives someone to attack 60 enemy aircraft alone? To charge a battleship fleet with a destroyer escort? To take command when every regulation says you have no authority? The men in these stories faced moments when every rational calculation pointed toward retreat or surrender. Dick Best could have followed the other dive bombers to the same target. Commander Beckton could have abandoned Laffey after the first hits. Lieutenant Commander McCandless had no formal authority to direct his ship's actions. Yet they chose to act. Not because they were fearless, they understood the mathematics perfectly. They acted because their training, their duty, and their concern for others demanded it. These decisions carried different outcomes. Philip Adair disrupted a bombing formation and returned home alive. Neil Kirby pursued personal achievement and paid with his life. Bill Dunham chose mercy over vengeance in a moment that revealed character beyond warfare. Each story demonstrates how individuals responded when circumstances demanded more than seemed possible. Best's split-second decision to attack a different target contributed to American victory at Midway. Thomas McCarthy's flag-raising under fire inspired his shipmates to continue fighting. These actions, documented in military records and survivor testimonies, show ordinary people rising to extraordinary circumstances. We face our own impossible choices, though rarely with such dramatic stakes. Career decisions that seem overwhelming. Family crises that demand more than we think we can give. Moments when doing what's right costs more than we want to pay. The historical record shows us this. Heroes aren't born in moments of certainty. They're forged when everything seems lost.